He had no idea what to expect when he saw the stray German Shepherd on the side of the road. Thin, scared, and ready to give birth. She didn't trust anyone. She just wanted to find a safe place. But when he tried to help her, something happened. Something no one could have predicted. And what he saw minutes after the birth changed everything. You won't believe what happened that night. The road was quiet, illuminated only by the dull glow of streetlights. Daniel Carter, 37 years old, was driving home after a long shift. His short brown hair was slightly messy, and his eyes were heavy with exhaustion. The soft hum of the car engine was the only sound breaking the silence of the night. Then, he saw her. A thin, frail German Shepherd standing just off the road near the tree line. Her ribs were faintly visible, her fur dull and matted. But what caught Daniel's attention was her swollen belly. She was pregnant, and she was alone. Daniel slowed the car, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. What was she doing out here? The dog took a cautious step back, her ears low, tail tucked tightly against her body. She didn't trust him, and Daniel knew that if he made the wrong move, she would disappear into the darkness, alone, afraid, and about to give birth with no one to help her. He had to act fast. Carefully, Daniel turned off the engine, his heart pounding as he slowly opened the car door. "Hey girl," he said softly, his voice calm but firm. "It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you." The Pastora Alma flinched, stepping back toward the shadows. Her deep brown eyes darted around, searching for an escape. But she was weak. Daniel could see it in the way her legs trembled, in the way her breathing was heavy and uneven. She didn't have much time. A choice had to be made. Daniel reached into his car and grabbed the only thing he had, a half-eaten sandwich from his lunch. He tore off a small piece and gently placed it on the pavement. Then, he backed away and waited. For a long moment, the German Shepherd didn't move. She just stood there, watching him. Then, slowly, she took a step forward. Her nose twitched, catching the scent of food. Her deep brown eyes flickered between the sandwich and Daniel, as if trying to decide if she could take the risk. Daniel didn't breathe. Then, finally, she lowered her head and ate. Daniel didn't move. He watched as the frail German Shepherd carefully chewed the small piece of food, her body tense, ready to flee at any sudden movement. She was starving. He could see it in the way she swallowed quickly, in the way her ribs pushed against her thin fur. But more than hunger, she was afraid. Daniel had to be careful. If he moved too fast, she would run. If he moved too slow, she might collapse before he could help her. And worse, she was pregnant. He slowly reached into the bag and tore off another piece of his sandwich. Placing it gently on the ground, just a little closer to him, she hesitated. Her deep brown eyes flickered toward his hand, watching him, waiting. And then, she stepped forward. It was just an inch, just the smallest movement. But for her, it was everything. Daniel's heart clenched. This wasn't just a stray dog. She had once belonged to someone. He could see it in the way she moved, cautious but not completely wild. Someone had abandoned her. Someone had left her out here to survive on her own. And now, she was days, maybe hours, away from giving birth. Daniel glanced at the dark road stretching behind him. He was in the middle of nowhere. The nearest town was miles away, and she clearly hadn't been able to find food on her own. If he left her here, she wouldn't make it. She and her puppies would die. Daniel took a slow breath and made his decision. He wasn't leaving without her. He reached for the last piece of his sandwich, but this time, he didn't put it on the ground. Instead, he held it in his open palm, stretching his hand just slightly forward. This was it. If she took it from him, he would know. She was willing to trust him. The German Shepherd stiffened. Her ears flicked backward, her body low to the ground. Her deep brown eyes darted between the food and his hand. She wanted it, but she was still deciding, was he safe, or was this a trap? Daniel didn't speak. He didn't move. He just let her choose. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, she stepped forward. Her nose twitched, and finally, she gently took the food from his hand. Daniel exhaled slowly, and then, just as quickly, she collapsed. Her frail body slumped to the ground, her breathing suddenly sharp and uneven. Daniel's stomach dropped. She was too weak, too exhausted. And now, she was in labor, right there, in the dirt. Daniel's mind raced. She wasn't going to survive out here. If he didn't get her somewhere safe right now, she and her puppies wouldn't make it. He didn't have time to think. Daniel took off his jacket and gently wrapped it around her. Careful not to startle her, she barely reacted. She was too tired to fight. She was trusting him now, whether she wanted to or not. Daniel scooped her up in his arms, her frail body lighter than he expected, and carried her toward his truck. This wasn't just about saving her. It was about saving the tiny lives inside of her too, and he wasn't going to fail her. Daniel moved as fast as he could without jostling her frail body. The German Shepherd barely stirred in his arms, her head resting limply against his chest. Her breathing was slow, uneven, too shallow. He reached his truck and carefully laid her across the back seat, still wrapped in his jacket. For a second he hesitated. She had barely trusted him moments ago. Would she panic when the door shut? Would she try to run? But she didn't move. She was too weak. Daniel swallowed hard and shut the door. Sliding into the driver's seat, he started the engine. She flinched at the noise, her ears twitching slightly, but she didn't lift her head. That worried him even more. He needed to hurry. The road stretched ahead, empty and dark, the headlights cutting through the night. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he pushed the truck to go faster. The closest veterinary clinic was too far. His house, however, wasn't. It wasn't a perfect plan, but he didn't have time to come up with a better one. He had medical supplies, blankets, food, and water. He could help her through the night and get her to a vet first thing in the morning. If she made it until morning, that thought hit him hard, making his chest tighten. She had trusted him enough to let him help her. He wasn't going to let her down now. The drive home felt longer than it should have. Daniel kept glancing in the rearview mirror, watching the dog's shallow breathing, the slow rise and fall of her frail body. Her belly was swollen, the puppies inside of her shifting slightly. She didn't have much time. His headlights flashed against his driveway as he pulled up to his house. The moment he cut the engine, he jumped out and opened the back door. The German Shepherd remained still. For a moment he feared the worst. Then, she let out a slow, weak sigh. She was still with him. Carefully Daniel scooped her up again, carrying her toward his house. The night air was cool, a faint wind brushing through the trees. But the moment he stepped inside, warmth surrounded them both. Soft lighting, a clean floor, blankets. This was safety. And now, it was hers. He placed her gently on a folded comforter near the fireplace, tucking the edges around her frail body. She didn't resist. She didn't panic. She just lay there, her deep brown eyes barely open, as if she was still trying to understand what was happening. Daniel knelt beside her, brushing a few stray leaves from her dull fur. "You're okay now," he murmured. "I promise." She blinked slowly, and for the first time, her tail gave the faintest thump against the blanket. The room was quiet, except for the soft crackling of the fireplace. Daniel sat cross-legged beside the frail German Shepherd, his hands resting on his knees as he watched her closely. She was exhausted. Her deep brown eyes fluttered open and shut, her thin chest rising and falling unevenly. Every so often, she would shift slightly, adjusting her weight on the thick comforter beneath her. He had given her some water, but she had barely lapped at it. And the most concerning part, she was starting to tremble. Daniel had never delivered puppies before. He had no idea what he was doing, but he knew one thing for sure. She didn't have much time. A low whimper broke the silence. Daniel's heart clenched. She was in pain. She shifted again, this time more urgently, her ears flicking back as her body tensed. Then, he saw it. The first contraction. His stomach dropped. It was happening. Right now. Daniel grabbed his phone and quickly searched for how to help a dog give birth. His fingers trembled slightly as he scrolled, trying to take in as much information as possible. Keep the area warm. Don't interfere unless absolutely necessary. Make sure each puppy is breathing. He exhaled sharply, tossing his phone onto the couch. This was real. This was happening. And he was the only one here to help her. The contractions came faster. The German Shepherd whined softly, her body tensing with each wave of pain. Daniel knelt closer but didn't touch her. She had to do this on her own. Still, he whispered softly, his voice steady. "You're okay, girl. You're doing great." Her deep brown eyes flickered toward him, just for a second. Then, her body shuddered, and the first tiny, slick shape appeared. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. A puppy. It was so small, so fragile. The mother immediately turned, her instincts kicking in despite her exhaustion. She licked the newborn, cleaning away the sack, her movements slow but determined. Then, a small, barely audible sound. The puppy had let out its first breath. Daniel let out one too. One down. But it wasn't over yet. Minutes passed. Then another contraction. Another puppy. Then another. And another. Daniel counted them as they came, his heart racing. 4, 5, 6. The mother worked tirelessly, her weak body trembling but never stopping. She cleaned them, nuzzled them, pulled them closer to her frail frame. Daniel could see the exhaustion taking over her, but she refused to stop. Because now, she wasn't alone anymore. She had something to fight for. The last puppy arrived nearly 40 minutes later. 7 in total. Tiny, delicate bodies squirming against their mother's thin belly, their tiny mouths latching on for warmth and nourishment. Daniel exhaled, running a hand through his hair. He had no idea how, but they had done it. She had done it. He looked at her, her head rested against the blanket, her eyes barely open, her chest still rising and falling in shallow breaths. She was exhausted. But she was okay. She had made it. And as Daniel watched the newborn puppies snuggle close to their mother, a lump formed in his throat, because he knew, if he hadn't found her when he did, this moment never would have happened. She would have been alone. But now, she wasn't alone anymore. She had her family. And maybe, just maybe, she had him too. The room was warm, the soft glow of the fireplace casting gentle flickers of light against the walls. Daniel leaned against the couch, exhaustion creeping into his body. His heart was still racing from the intensity of the last hour. But now, the chaos had settled. The mother German Shepherd lay curled protectively around her 7 newborn puppies, her frail body wrapped around them as if shielding them from the world. They were tiny, barely larger than the palm of Daniel's hand, their fur still damp from birth. Some squirmed against their mother's belly, while others had already begun suckling, their tiny paws kneading against her ribs. Daniel should have felt relief, but something didn't feel right. His eyes scanned the German Shepherd's weak frame, the way her chest rose and fell unevenly. Her breathing was too shallow, her body was too still, and then he saw it. One of the puppies, motionless. Daniel's stomach dropped. He moved quickly, kneeling beside the mother, careful not to startle her. The puppy wasn't moving. His tiny chest wasn't rising. His body was too still, too cold. Daniel's breath caught. No, not now. He hesitated. Should he interfere? The mother had been doing everything instinctually, cleaning and nursing her puppies without his help. But this one wasn't breathing. Daniel swallowed hard. He had no choice. Carefully, he reached out and gently lifted the tiny body into his hands. It was so small, so fragile, and it wasn't making a sound. He rubbed its tiny body, trying to stimulate movement, trying to bring it back. The mother's deep brown eyes flickered toward him, but she didn't growl or panic. It was almost as if she knew, as if she was watching, waiting, hoping. Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears. "Come on, little one," he whispered, rubbing the puppy's chest with his fingers. Still nothing. His throat tightened. No, he refused to let this happen. He gently massaged the puppy's sides, willing air into its tiny lungs. Nothing. He shifted, carefully bringing the puppy to his mouth, gently blowing air past its tiny muzzle. Not too hard, but just enough to try to stimulate a response. Seconds felt like an eternity. Then, a small gasp, a twitch, then finally, a tiny, weak whimper. Daniel let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. The puppy stirred in his hands, its tiny chest rising and falling in shaky but real breaths. It was alive. The mother's ears twitched, her tired brown eyes fixed on the newborn in Daniel's hands. Slowly, carefully, He returned the puppy to its mother's side, watching as it instinctively nuzzled against her belly, searching for warmth. Daniel's hands were still trembling. He sat back, his heart pounding, his lungs burning with the breath he had been holding for too long. That had been too close. The mother lowered her head, gently sniffing the puppy before licking it once, as if confirming that it was truly safe. Then, finally, she relaxed again. Daniel wiped a hand down his face. He had never experienced anything like this before. The thought of losing even one of those tiny lives. It was unbearable, but they had made it. All of them. For the first time in who knows how long, this German Shepherd wasn't alone. She had her puppies. And she had him. And he wasn't going to leave them. Not now. Not ever. The night stretched on, silent except for the soft crackling of the fireplace and the rhythmic breathing of the mother German Shepherd. Daniel sat on the floor beside her, his back leaning against the couch. He should have been exhausted, but his mind wouldn't rest. The puppies were now nestled against their mother, their tiny bodies huddled close for warmth. The puppy that had almost slipped away was still weak, but breathing. Daniel exhaled slowly. He had never expected this. Stopping to help a stray dog was one thing, but helping her bring 7 new lives into the world, that was something else entirely. He glanced down at the mother. She was watching him. Her deep brown eyes, no longer filled with the raw fear they once held, were now softer, calmer. For the first time since he found her, she looked at peace. Daniel reached out, hesitating slightly before resting his hand gently on her side. She flinched. Just a little. Then, after a moment, she relaxed. Her thin body was still weak, her fur still dull from malnourishment, but for the first time, she let him touch her. Daniel felt something tighten in his chest. He had earned her trust. She had let him help her, protect her, and now, as her body rested and her puppy suckled quietly at her belly, she was letting him stay. He swallowed hard, his fingers brushing gently over her frail frame. "You did good, girl," he murmured. "Really good." Her ears twitched slightly, and then, she let out a soft sigh, lowering her head onto her paws. And Daniel knew. She was safe. She wasn't alone anymore. At some point, exhaustion took over. Daniel had barely closed his eyes before the first rays of sunlight peeked through the window. He blinked, groggy, his body stiff from sleeping on the floor. The first thing he saw, the German Shepherd. She was still curled up with her puppies, but she wasn't sleeping. She was watching him. When he moved, her tail thumped softly against the blanket. Daniel's lips parted slightly. It was the first time she had wagged her tail. His heart clenched. This dog, this terrified, abandoned, starving dog, was starting to trust him. And that meant something. Something big. He pushed himself up, stretching before heading toward the kitchen. "You're probably starving," he murmured, glancing back at her. She didn't take her eyes off him. For the first time, she looked like she wanted to follow. Daniel hesitated. Then he crouched slightly, patting his thigh in a gentle, welcoming motion. "Come on, girl," he said softly. She hesitated. Her ears flicked forward, considering. And then, she stood. It was shaky, unsteady, but she took a step toward him. And that was all that mattered. The morning air was crisp, filtering through the slightly open window. The faint smell of coffee lingered in the kitchen as Daniel stood at the counter, pouring dry dog food into a bowl. Behind him, the German Shepherd stood hesitantly in the doorway, watching. She had followed him, not because she was forced to, not because she was afraid, but because she wanted to. Daniel placed the bowl on the floor and stepped back, giving her space. She sniffed the food cautiously before lowering her head and taking the first bite. For the first time since he found her, she was eating without hesitation. Daniel swallowed hard, watching her ribs shift beneath her fur as she chewed. She was still weak, still frail, but she was trying. And that meant everything. A new beginning. Daniel crouched beside her, careful not to startle her. "You need a name, girl," he murmured. She flicked her ears, glancing at him between bites. Something stirred in his chest. The first night he had found her, she had been curled up in the dirt, barely holding on. Now, she was here, safe, alive, a fighter. He thought for a moment, then smiled softly. "Luna," he said. Her ears perked slightly. "Luna," he repeated, more certain this time. She blinked slowly. And then, as if responding, her tail gave the faintest wag. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The choice that changed everything. The puppies had fallen asleep again, their tiny bodies piled together on the blanket near the fireplace. Luna curled protectively around them. But this time, she wasn't watching Daniel with fear. She was watching him with something else. Something warmer. Something trusting. Daniel exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. He had never planned for this. He had never expected to find a pregnant dog on the side of the road. Never expected to bring her home. Never expected to witness 7 tiny lives come into the world right in his living room. But now, as he looked at her, at Luna, at her puppies, he knew he couldn't walk away from this. He couldn't let them go. His voice was quiet when he spoke. "You're staying," he murmured. Luna's deep brown eyes locked onto his. Daniel reached out, resting a gentle hand on her head. And this time, she leaned into his touch. For the first time, she wasn't just surviving. She was home. Luna was no longer just a stray, no longer just a survivor. She was home. She had found warmth, safety, and something she never thought she'd have again. Trust. Her puppies would grow up never knowing hunger, fear, or the cold loneliness of the streets. And Daniel? He hadn't just saved a dog that night. She had saved him too. Because sometimes, the most unexpected moments change everything. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe and leave a like. Share this video with someone who loves animals and believes in second chances. Together, we can spread more stories of hope, resilience, and love.